Thanks so much everyone for watching. We've got an epic lineup tonight of speakers. We've got an awesome panel here. Amazing group of functional doctors, technology, activists for a leap forward in medicine.
This is a great gathering.
You know, our goal is to make it easy for practitioners to learn in community.
There's a lot of community happening tonight. I want to say welcome to all of the communities that are watching at home. This ecosystem that has been set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network that we are looking to develop, and it all revolves around you. There's an exponential potential to the future of medicine. This is an allopathic conversion machine that we have just created. And it has exponential potential because it can be seen by 1 billion people at no extra cost. That's the beauty of the internet.
Welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Please welcome your host, James Masco.
Hello and welcome to the Functional Forum. This month's episode is on medical cannabis. And before we get into the speakers and the luminaries that we have coming up later in the show, we wanted to take just 2 minutes to share with you the history of cannabis and how it's been used by mankind, how it made it to America, and all of those good things. So we found an epic video from CNN that we're going to introduce now. In 2 minutes, you're going to get 5,000 years of history. Enjoy.
It's around 2730 BC. Legendary Emperor Shen Nung, regarded as the father of Chinese medicine, is exploring the benefits of marijuana for everything from malaria to poor memory. Use soon spreads across the continent. Though even back then, overuse supposedly caused blindness, sexual problems, and hallucinations, or as they called it, seeing devils. Irish doctor William O'Shaughnessy introduced weed to England and America in 1840, treating seizures, nausea, and menstrual cramps. Queen Victoria's doctor prescribed weed for his patients, leading many to wonder if the Queen ever took a toke to ease the pain of her monthly cycles. Across the ocean blue, George Washington grew hemp, but it wasn't the kind that gets you high. Still, rumors persist he used it for toothaches. Remember, he ended up with wooden teeth. Soon, weed was in all sorts of medicines. A paste treated corns on the feet, cannabis cigarettes for asthma attacks, cough mixtures given to both adults and children. Books at the time listed dozens of medical uses for weed, but it didn't last. In the early 1900s, laws designed to crack down on heroin and cocaine began to target marijuana, and public hysteria grew. The campy 1936 film Reefer Madness popularized weed's negative image.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
Showing stoned teens attempting to rape and kill, going insane, and committing suicide. Soon, marijuana possession and distribution were illegal. And in 1970, marijuana was classified as a Schedule I drug, with a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use.
So now that you know your history, let's get into the present right now. One of the most exciting things happening in the whole of cannabis and medical cannabis is the new UCLA Medical Cannabis Research Center, and its director is Dr. Jeffrey Chen. Let's go and catch up with him.
So my name is Dr. Jeff Chen. I'm the director of the new UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, and we're one of the first academic programs in the world focused on the study of cannabis and cannabinoids.
So Doc, what's actually in cannabis?
So cannabis contains hundreds of compounds. The one compound that has been most widely studied and known about is tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. And this compound is responsible for the psychoactive properties of cannabis that have been well known. But there's actually over 100 different cannabinoids, right? These are molecules that are relatively unique to the cannabis plant. So in addition to THC, there's other cannabinoids like CBD, which is the second most abundant cannabinoid in cannabis, as well as cannabinoids like CBN, CBC, CBG. In addition to the cannabinoids, you have other compounds in cannabis such as terpenes, which we know have physiologic properties. And in addition to that, there's also certain fatty acids, and you can even find flavonoids in cannabis as well. So there's a whole mix of compounds in this plant.
So Doc, what is the history of evidence of utility for cannabis in medicine?
So, in addition to the historical context of cannabis use, even today, right now, we have FDA-approved medications based on cannabinoids. So ever since the 1980s, we've had Medicinal in America, which is synthetic THC, and it's approved for nausea induced by chemotherapy, as well as anorexia in patients who have AIDS, for example. In Europe, they also have something called Sativex, which is a combination of THC and CBD that is approved there for multiple sclerosis. And here in the US, we're in very late stage FDA clinical trials for a drug called Epidiolex, which is essentially purified CBD for pediatric epilepsy. So there are FDA-approved versions of medications of the same compounds that are found in cannabis. It's just strange that cannabis today remains a Schedule I drug in the US, which heavily restricts research as well as limits the amount of funding that can go towards therapeutic research into cannabis.
So how do cannabinoids actually work inside the body? What's the mechanism?
So we went hunting, and it was in the early 90s that we finally cloned the cannabinoid receptor. And then we realized there's multiple subtypes of these receptors. So there's the CB1 receptor, which is present mainly in the brain, and then there's a CB2 receptor, which is mainly present on immune cells. But in fact, they're also distributed widely throughout the body. They're found on our liver cells, fat cells, muscle cells, bone tissue. So it's distributed throughout our body, and it's not just a neurotransmitter, although its predominant function is still neurotransmission, and it's still most concentrated in the brain.
What are the functions of the endocannabinoid system?
So the endocannabinoid system, first off, it's a very primitive system. So we think it evolved over 500 million years ago. So it's as old as our endogenous opiate system. And the functions are also quite broad. So it's everything from mood, memory, sleep, the pain response, the stress response, immune function, reproductive function, energy metabolism. And we're finding the endocannabinoid system is even implicated, it's very critical in embryology and development. And we find that within just a few days of embryonic life that they already start expressing CB1 receptors. And interestingly, breast milk is actually very abundant in endocannabinoids. So this is an important physiologic system in our body. Endocannabinoids are arguably one of the most widespread and versatile signaling molecules we have in our bodies. And this system is not just present in humans, it's preserved across all vertebrates. So mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, they all have endocannabinoid systems.
What are some of the other functions of the endocannabinoid system that our viewers might be interested in knowing about?
So if you had to sum up the function of the endocannabinoid system in one word, it would be homeostasis, and the maintenance of a stable environment despite external stressors and changes in the environment.
So let's get into the mechanism. What are some of the components of the endocannabinoid system?
So you have the endogenous cannabinoid receptors, the CB1 and CB2 receptors. You have the endogenous cannabinoids, the endocannabinoids. So you have anandamide and 2-AG. And then you have the enzymes that break down these endocannabinoids. So fatty acid amide hydrolase and monoacyl glycerol. And so these are things that break down endocannabinoids in the synaptic cleft. So the CB1 receptor is the most abundant G-coupled protein receptor in the mammalian brain. It's most heavily concentrated in areas like the hippocampus and the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. But again, we're also finding that the CB1 receptor is present in other cells throughout the body, whether it's cells in our liver, fat, bone, skeletal muscle. And in contrast, the CB2 receptor we find is predominantly in our immune cells. So whether it's leukocytes circulating through our blood or in the microglia, the white blood cells of the brain. But again, the CB2 receptor is also found in cells in the bone, heart tissue, lung tissue, liver tissue, and our reproductive organs as well. So the endocannabinoids are, classically you can think of them as neurotransmitters, but you also find that they're circulating throughout the blood in the body. And endocannabinoids are, the precursors to endocannabinoids are omega fatty acids. And you find that when you supplement omega fatty acids into your diet, you do see a boost in endocannabinoid levels in the brain.
So to follow on from that, how does endocannabinoid signaling work?
So this might be easier if I show you a diagram to kind of walk you through how endocannabinoid signaling works. So if you take a look at picture A, you have a presynaptic neuron, and it's showing the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And so as the action potential travels down the neuron, it's going to trigger these voltage-gated calcium channels. You're going to have an influx of calcium, and it's going to release, in this example, a neurotransmitter like glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate is going to bind to its downstream receptors, which are going to then open calcium channels on the postsynaptic neuron, and then the action potential will continue to propagate. So that's classically how we're going to think of this neurotransmitter example. Now, in picture B, when there's endocannabinoids involved in the picture, here's what happens. So the action potential travels down the presynaptic cell, glutamate is released, and what's happening in addition to triggering calcium influx in the postsynaptic cell, you also have on-demand synthesis of endocannabinoids. Again, taken from the fatty acids that are actually sitting in the cell membrane, you have on-demand synthesis of endocannabinoids. And these endocannabinoids travel in a retrograde fashion, and they travel across the synaptic cleft back to the presynaptic cell. And that's where the CB1 receptor resides. And when they activate the CB1 receptor, you actually attenuate the influx of calcium. So this is a way for the postsynaptic cell to have a protective measure against too much excitation, for example, in this case. So having this auto-protective negative feedback mechanism. So this is very different to how typical neurotransmitters work. And the other thing that's interesting to note is that classic neurotransmitters are water-soluble. And so they're made beforehand and stored in vesicles. Like in this diagram, we see glutamate is stored in vesicles and released on demand. Endocannabinoids, being lipid-soluble, you can't really store them in vesicles as readily. They'll just kind of float out. So they're synthesized on demand, released on demand, travel in a retrograde fashion, and afterwards they're degraded by these enzymes like FAAH, which degrades anandamide, or MAGL, which degrades 2-AG.
So the obvious follow-up question from there is, how do the cannabinoids in cannabis actually interact with that system?
So it turns out that THC is a partial agonist. It's not a full agonist, it's a partial agonist at both the CB1 and the CB2 receptor. In contrast, CBD doesn't really seem to have much activity at either one of those receptors. And so CBD is an interesting molecule in that sense. And we think that some of the ways that CBD is actually exerting its effect, well, one way, we think that it actually inhibits the enzyme FAAH. So by inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down endocannabinoids, CBD is actually boosting levels of certain endocannabinoids like anandamide. CBD is also targeting non-cannabinoid receptors like serotonin receptors, vanilloid receptors, as well as being an allosteric modulator at the cannabinoid receptor. So not being an agonist, but more of an allosteric modulator. And we're actually finding that it appears that, for example, that CBD is a negative allosteric modulator at the CB1 receptor. And that's how it might be able to actually attenuate the psychoactivity of THC when given in combination with THC.
What do you see as the sort of therapeutic potential for the endocannabinoid system?
What we're actually finding is that in a incredibly wide variety of pathologic states, that the dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system is implicated. So if you're taking a look at CNS diseases, so certain neurodegenerative diseases, we're finding that the endocannabinoid system could be a therapeutic target, all the way from neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's to mood disorders like depression or anxiety to even schizophrenia. You're finding that it looks like low levels of anandamide might actually be contributing to schizophrenia. And in fact, when it appears that there's one human study where they actually gave CBD and have found that it was actually able to treat the psychosis of schizophrenia, and they believe that the mechanism is the CBD is boosting anandamide levels. We're also finding that the endocannabinoid system could be a therapeutic target for cardiovascular disorders, liver diseases, inflammatory bowel disorders, all the way to being implicated in obesity and diabetes, implicated in certain bone disorders like osteoporosis, and implicated in cancer as well. as well as autoimmune disorders. And so you can see that targeting endocannabinoid system, it's a wide new area for drug development. And it's interesting that right now we don't really have many drugs that target the endocannabinoid system. Like we said, we have Medicinal and we have Sativex. And actually there was a drug that was targeting the endocannabinoid system called rimonabant. And it was designed to actually block the CB1 receptor, because the CB1 receptor, when stimulated, increases appetite and fat storage. And so it was designed to block the CB1 receptor, and it did work, right? It decreased appetite, and it led to weight loss, but it was pulled from the market because it found that it also significantly increased rates of depression and suicide. So this is a very complicated system, and we're actively trying to do targeted drug development, but we have to be very careful about how we approach it, as evidenced by the kind of case of rimonabant.
Where do you see the money for that research coming from?
At least traditionally, there's been very little funding for therapeutic research into cannabis, right? So here in the U.S., cannabis is a Schedule I drug, which means that it has no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. So it's lumped together with drugs like heroin or LSD. And so that creates significant research barriers. Cannabis is arguably the single hardest compound to study in America because of all these layers of approval you have to go through, as well as you're kind of limited in where you can even get cannabis to use in your studies. And moreover, because it's a Schedule I drug, you can't really get federal funding for therapeutic research. You can get federal funding for research into the harm and abuse potential, but not really therapeutic research.
Is there any improvement in that with states changing the way that it's regulated in their state?
Yeah, so despite a majority of U.S. states having either legal medical or legal recreational cannabis, the federal laws are still the same. As a university, there are actually, from my office, I can see dispensaries in Westwood, but we're not allowed to use that product in our studies. So regardless of what California has done or will do with cannabis, we still have to abide by those same federal measures that haven't changed since the 1970s. So half a century, we're still working under those rules and regulations, unfortunately.
So one question we've had come up is, how do you modulate the endocannabinoid activity?
We talked about exogenous cannabinoids, things like phytocannabinoids that might modulate endocannabinoid system activity. There's also non-cannabinoids that also modulate endocannabinoid system activity. So beta-caryophyllene, which is present in cannabis, it's also present in black pepper. That's a CB2 agonist, interestingly. There's also lifestyle modifications that we find can change endocannabinoid system activity. So we're finding that after exercise, you do boost endocannabinoid system levels. And I think there's more and more evidence now that this runner's high that we've been talking about might be more due to endocannabinoids than the release of endorphins, right, our endogenous opiates. It also appears that there's other pharmaceutical or other drugs in general, pharmacologic drugs, things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, things like ibuprofen, we're finding actually boosts endocannabinoid levels. So it could be that that's one of the mechanisms that that things like ibuprofen are able to exert some of their effects. And lastly, we said diet. So things like intake of omega fatty acids have been shown to boost endocannabinoid levels.
So Doc, you've obviously got an amazing position here at UCLA to be able to make significant impact in this industry. What is going to be your research priority and your focus at UCLA?
I would say that it would be the use of cannabis or its cannabinoids for their opioid-sparing properties. And so it's well known that America is in crisis right now with this opioid epidemic. It's the worst this country has ever seen. There you have an opioid overdose every 15 minutes. So since we started this interview, an American has died from an opioid overdose. And it's not slowing down. And in fact, this epidemic is so profound that it's actually bending the life expectancy curve of our country. So life expectancy in this country has been climbing every single year for the last quarter century. And over the last year, it's actually fallen. And so that's how powerful this epidemic is. And so with cannabis and the compounds within it, we know that it's useful for pain, and specifically chronic pain. And in fact, the National Academy of Sciences Medicine and Engineering came out with a landmark review, and they stated that there was conclusive evidence that cannabinoids could be used for chronic pain. Number two, we're seeing at a population epidemiologic level that states that enact medical cannabis programs see overall less opioid prescriptions and less opioid overdoses. And again, this is correlation, doesn't imply causation, but it's certainly adding to the weight of evidence that this could actually be used to address the current opioid epidemic. And the third part is, in very controlled laboratory settings, we see that cannabinoids have opioid-sparing properties. So if you add cannabinoids to opioids, you need significantly less opioids to achieve the same level of pain relief. Okay, so for all of these reasons, I think it's critical that we investigate the potential of cannabis and the compounds within it to act to both treat chronic pain as well as for their opioid-sparing properties, to reduce the amount of opioids that people need to achieve the same level of pain relief.
Do you see anyone else thinking in the same way as you on that?
I'm sure there's other people out there who also want to do this kind of work. So far, there has not been a longitudinal clinical study of the use of cannabis or cannabinoids in pain patients who are on opioids. And that's work that I really want to prioritize and push through here at UCLA. And part of the reason, again, going back to this is a large clinical trial like this will take millions of dollars, and so it's really securing the funding to be able to pull off work like this.
Where are we at this day today with regard to states and what they can do and what they can't do with cannabis, medical cannabis?
In states that have medical cannabis laws, doctors still aren't really prescribing them, because to prescribe something, that has to mean that there's a standardized, replicatable, high-quality source that patients can go to get the medicine from. That doesn't really exist. So rather than prescribing it, doctors recommend cannabis. And there was actually a federal court case back in 2000 that reaffirmed the right of physicians to recommend, not prescribe, to recommend cannabis to patients in states that allowed it, and those physicians would be protected from any sort of federal prosecution. And so, and then in states that have legalized medical cannabis, their state medical licensing board also recognizes the ability of physicians to recommend cannabis. Where it gets a little gray is typically physicians aren't allowed to necessarily recommend a particular brand or particular product, nor are they necessarily allowed to direct patients to a particular store or dispensary.
So now that we've got the science from Dr. Chen, let's check in with Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, the godfather of the endocannabinoid system. This footage from this interview is generously provided from the Holistic Cannabis Academy, and we thank them for sponsoring this event, and we'll tell you more about what you can do with them a little bit later on. In the meantime, enjoy. So, Doc, what do you see as the role for THC and CBD in the practice of medicine?
Both compounds are of extreme interest, but not for the same diseases. I mean, I'm speaking now of the medical side alone. I'm not speaking of the recreational part. And in the medical side, there are diseases, there are disease states that THC is more important than CBD. And there are other disease states where CBD is more important. For example, in autoimmune diseases, diseases in which the body attacks itself for various reasons, CBD seems to be much better than THC. For example, in diabetes type 1, it is a disease in which the body attacks the cells that produce insulin. And CBD, cannabidiol, is much more important than THC. In other disease states like trauma, it is apparently THC is more important.
So, Doc, what role do you see cannabis playing in upregulating the endocannabinoid system?
The endocannabinoid system is of extreme importance. On the health side, there was just a review recently by senior people at NIH, and they wrote that the endocannabinoid system is involved in essentially all human diseases. And that means also in states. And so obviously it's of extreme importance. Now, does it help situations which are not really clinical? Most of us are anxious. some point or another, or slightly depressed at one point or another. These are not clinical situations, these are situations of every day. And chances are that, yes, cannabidiol can affect that. Cannabidiol most definitely affects anxiety, most definitely helps with depression. So if it's extreme, then of course it's a disease. But many of these things are not extreme. And in this case, cannabidiol, I believe, can help.
I know you've been on the front lines of looking at head injury in American football, and that's coming up as a big topic in American society right now. What are some of the most interesting things that are happening in that field?
Well, American football has a lot of problems. And some of the problems are head injury, closed head injury. And some of the people that smoke cannabis after football take it for the head injury rather than as an anti-opiate compound. And yes, cannabidiol, in mice at least, is a good agent against the head injury. We've tried that. I collaborate with Professor Esti Shohami, and she's a specialist in this field, and she has found that yes, cannabidiol definitely helps with brain injury. Quite a few other compounds do the same. But again, we don't have a clinical trial. It's not simple to do it. But we need better clinical trials. I'm under the impression that it helps.
One of the things that we found is that there's a lot of interest in the field of medical cannabis for children who are having seizures and so forth. What's been your experience with that?
Many years ago, about 35 years ago, or even more, we did a clinical trial with cannabidiol. First, of course, we did a lot of work in mice. Then we found that the compound is not toxic, that the compound can help with epileptic attacks in mice. So we went and did a clinical trial in human patients, not children. We had 15 patients. Half of them were controls, half of them took cannabidiol, relatively high doses, and we were amazed how good it was. We found that out of the 8 patients that nothing was helping them anymore, out of these 8 patients, 4 had no attacks while they were given cannabidiol. 3 patients had much less, and only 1 was not affected. And that was 35 years ago. Now, I'm not a clinician, and at the university we don't have the ability to the money to do a clinical trial, and I expected that neurologists will pick up this initial work and expand it. Nothing happened. For 30 odd years, nothing happened. I mean, that's a shame, because we could have helped children or adults over that period of time. And again, nothing happened. I used to go to neurologists, say, well, we can't do it, we don't have the facilities, cannabidiol comes from marijuana, from hashish, of course we will never get a permit, etc., etc. So for 35 years, nothing happened until parents found that it helps their children, and they started giving them cannabis with high levels of cannabidiol, and in many cases, about 60-70% of cases, it helped the children. Now, why did we have to wait for 35 years after an initial clinical trial? Small one, yes, but it showed that it works. Many drugs, many major drugs, started with a small trial. It still doesn't happen with most diseases where we know that cannabidiol helps. We know that patients are using it without having a clinical trial. I don't want to use a strong word, but it's a shame that this has not happened.
Doc, where do you get the most hope for change in a medical system, particularly with medical cannabis, that's been slow to adapt?
Well, I'm under the impression that things are changing. For many years, there were no clinical trials in the US, major clinical trials, period. Now things are changing. And I believe that there will be clinical trials, particularly with cannabidiol, less so with THC, because THC has its side effects. But there are enough things to do at the moment with cannabidiol itself. We had in Israel a clinical trial with an autoimmune disease, or a kind of autoimmune disease. In some cancer patients, the bone marrow has to be exchanged, and these people get bone marrow from the outside. The body doesn't like it and it attacks the bone marrow. It's kind of an autoimmune disease, not real, but a kind of autoimmune disease. The bone marrow that has been administered or that has been put in the body attacks the body attacks the bone marrow, and the patient is sick, at times very sick. So a clinical group at one of the hospitals in Israel tried high doses of pure cannabidiol, very high doses, 300-400 milligrams, and yes, it lowered many of the effects of this graft versus host disease. This is a name people usually use. So it works. It most definitely works. And as a matter of fact, a company has taken it over and is developing it. So here we have something that has clinical trial background, and I hope that we shall see many more. In another field, in schizophrenia, we showed many years ago in a few patients, a very few, 1 or 2, that it helps in cannabidiol, helps in schizophrenia, and a German group did quite a large clinical trial, very well done, published, and it showed that very high doses of cannabidiol, about 800 milligrams a day, or even more, definitely help with schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is a serious disease. We have 1% of the population in the world that has schizophrenia. Now, that's a lot of patients. And we need additional drugs, because the drugs available now, they're pretty good. Some of them are excellent, but most of them cause side effects. Cannabidiol causes essentially no side effects. Mm-hmm. So we need more clinical trials in schizophrenia, but it has been shown that it works.
Doc, what are some of the ways that you've seen that cannabis can be used most effectively in medicine at this stage?
In Israel, cannabis has to be approved by the Ministry of Health, which is the FDA in this case, and we have 26,000 patients that use cannabis for medical purposes. Most of them use it for pain, not acute pain. If you're going to have your tooth taken out, it's not for that, but it's for constant pain, neuropathic pain, pain that quite a few people have. And it helps. Most of the people, most out of these 26,000 patients, use it for pain, not all of them. And yes, it definitely helps. Again, we need better clinical data. Anxiety is a very complicated situation and very difficult to measure. People use it, it helps, but then again, we need more data. The same is true for depression. We need better depression drugs. The depression of A is not the same as depression in B and C and D. So we need a lot of more clinical data.
So I know in the past, Doc, you've been maybe a little bit critical of the use of cannabis for recreation. Can you clarify some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I've not been critical. I just state that the medical use and the recreational use should be separate. The medical use should be based on medical data, and it should be advanced as modern drugs are advanced through animal trials, through clinical trials, through everything that the new drug needs. The recreational use is a social issue. If the population of a certain state, certain country, wants to have cannabis open to everybody or to most people after a certain age, then that's fine. But it's a social issue. It has to be decided and a different background. Our population decided centuries ago that tobacco is fine. Although now we know that tobacco is a toxic agent, but it's a social issue. The society has decided it's okay. You can use it if you wish. The same is true for cannabis. You can use it if you wish, if the population of a certain state, country decides so. It's a social issue.
So one of the most exciting things about 2017 for the Evolution of Medicine and the Functional Forum has been the worldwide growth of the meetup groups. We now have over 500 meetup groups registered on 6 continents. And although this show is on medical cannabis, we're sad to say that we're not going to provide any specific cannabis-related nutrients to the meetup groups. However, the good news is there is another substance that has proven very good at helping to gel communities, and that is wine. And so we're really excited to be partnering with Dry Farm Wines. If you set up a meetup group and you can get 20 practitioners together, we will send you a case of wine from Dry Farm Wines. It is low alcohol, it is low sugar, it is suitable for diabetics, and it's great for bringing together a community. So go to meetup.functionalforum.com, register your community, meet up with local practitioners, invite local doctors in, and start to build a local community in your area. Check out the links below, and thanks so much for being part of our community. So if you've been watching the Functional Forum for a long time, you know that in the past we had sponsors on the show. And as of today, for today's episode, the sponsors, we have the Holistic Cannabis Academy, we have Dry Farm Wines, who provide wine for all the meetup groups, but the main sponsor is us, the Evolution of Medicine. And we're really excited to be able to help hundreds, if not thousands of practitioners now make the leap to having their own functional medicine practice. And what I wanted to do today was to share one of the lessons that we've been talking about in our accelerator on, it's November now. How do we make sure that we capture and engage the group of population that are going to be hungry for new ways of delivering wellness come January 1st, right? We all know that on January 1st, it's a big moment where people want to take care of their health in a different way. So how can we get set up? So what we're doing in the Practice Accelerator right now, and the new patient GPS with all the practitioners who we're working with, is helping them get set up to capture and influence local demand. And the way that they're doing that is through a technology called Eventbrite. So Eventbrite is a platform where you can put on your local events and you can capture the interest of people who are looking for local events. And so what we've helped practitioners to do is to set up a series of events throughout January, February, and March, which is the best time of year. The lowest cost for acquiring new people into the practice is January, February, and March. So we're helping practitioners do, say, like 2 events a month, every other Saturday from January until March, getting all of those events out there, getting dialed into who their exact target market is, and putting on events in their local community that educate the community about different ways to keep healthy. Really look at what are solutions, sustainable solutions to the healthcare crisis, and particularly how we can affect your health. And then also to give them the opportunity to become a member of your practice. By doing these educational events, you can become the go-to expert in your health community. You can use free online tools like Eventbrite to be able to set up a structure where random people who just happen to come to Eventbrite can come in, get in touch with your practice, can give you their phone number and email so you can follow up with them. If you want to become the go-to expert in your community on functional medicine, even on cannabis, you can do that today by setting up these events inside Eventbrite, linking them to your system, setting up the autoresponder. That is what we're helping people to do in our accelerator. So if this is interesting to you, it's not too late. Go to goevomed.com/brochure and you can download the brochure for the accelerator, or just get in touch with us and we'll help you to set up your practice for success in 2018 and beyond. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll get back to the content. So Doc, tell us a little bit about your journey to find yourself here as a practicing physician to working with medical cannabis every day.
I'm a clinical professor of medicine and rheumatology at both Cedars-Sinai and UCLA. But I'm also in private practice in rheumatology, and I see patients in my own practice. My patients are often patients who are in chronic pain, and they have an impaired quality of life due to their pain, and I want to do whatever I can to reduce their pain. And we have some standard allopathic medicines that we use, but sometimes they're sensitive and can't take them, or they don't work. And they come back to me as a court of last resort. What do I do? And I began to realize that there's another pain pathway that we can use, and that's cannabis, which may affect their perception or reaction to the pain as well. And I also realize, as somebody who uses functional medicine, that these same patients who are in pain often have nausea and sleep disturbance, and actually cannabis has effects on multiple systems. So we have a medication that may help them manage their pain, but may also affect multiple other systems. So I began to get interested in this. I actually was then asked by a national specialty organization to give a national talk, and I actually visited dispensaries, collective growers, and in the field, and learned a lot about the whole process as well, and then began to use it more widely in my practice. Then it also led to my interest in the preclinical work, and we've heard in this program from Rafi Meshulam, there's some great work at Hebrew University suggesting possible applicability in bone. When I see my patients who come into me who are on opioids, then I start talking with them about the fact that there is a condition called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, where with time they will need higher and higher doses of opioids, since there is good data to suggest that the opioid receptor gets downregulated. And so I like to use cannabis in those patients to help them taper down on their opioids, which I think is extremely important. And then it improves not only their opioid needs, but actually often improves their functionality.
What are some of the issues that you've seen that would make you think cannabis is going to be a good fit for them?
Well, first of all, remember, Jim, that I'm a rheumatologist. Okay, so as a rheumatologist who's treating people in pain, first of all, pain most, but as I mentioned earlier, I might be seeing some sleep problems, fitful non-restorative sleep, some nausea. Those are the top ones I see, but certainly also it has effects on muscle spasticity, which I can see in some of my patients. Certainly some of my patients have mentioned their effects on glaucoma as well, and generally it can be used for a variety of other conditions beyond those. It's been used widely in HIV and in cancer, and also in inflammatory bowel disease now, some signals. I'm certainly very intrigued by some of the newer, really exciting control data in pediatric populations, particularly in children who had seizures nonstop that was resistant to other therapies, that we can stop or reduce the frequency of seizures. And now we're seeing some other signals in patients who are children who've got a blood cancer, where we wipe out their bone marrow, give them a donor bone marrow, but occasionally the donor bone marrow actually attacks the child. And that's called graft versus host. And there's some signals that are now leading to formal clinical trials that it looks like that can slow down, prevent, or treat this illness, graft versus host, which can be fatal.
So Doc, one question that's come up a lot. What are terpenes and why are they relevant to medical cannabis?
Well, terpenes are one part. There's several hundred compounds in cannabis. Certainly we are all familiar with CBD and THC, and people are less familiar with terpenes. Terpenes are fragrant oils that impart some smell and taste, so some people may notice when they taste an oil, it doesn't taste so good. That's often usually the terpene. But the terpene may become important too. It can interact. There's something called entourage effect, where you get the whole plant works together, so terpenes can help. They might, for example, in some terpenes help the cannabis cross the blood-brain barrier. So they're actually an important part of the equation as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the entourage effect and what it is?
The entourage effect talks to whole plant medicine. And what we've learned is some of the compounds in cannabis that we're most familiar with, such as CBD or THC, actually may have more efficacy if they're combined together or with other compounds in a plant. So if there's an additive effect when you add more compounds together. Remember, there's several hundred compounds in the plant.
You know, what would you say are the advantages of using a non-allopathic strategy, like you said, like using something like cannabis in practice?
Well, I use the cannabis in practice for several reasons. First of all, I'm trying to achieve better pain and total body management, not only of the pain, but of other associated symptoms we talked about, like sleep. I also use it because I often see patients in pain who are already on opioids. And we all know that opioids have their limitations. We're all aware of the opioid epidemic. We're all aware that with time and increasing doses, you get something called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, where you downregulate all the opioid receptors and it stops working. And the patients think they got to keep increasing the dose, but then that leads to significant risk. So when I see a patient on opioids, one of the first questions I have is to start talking with them. Can we use cannabis to help lower your opioid dose? And I think that's an important part of a dialogue that I have with my patients as well.
When you go to these rheumatology conferences or otherwise, do you see other rheumatologists who are interested in this conversation?
My peers generally don't know very much about it at this point. They hear from patients that it might be useful, and they'd like to certainly learn a lot more about it. And I think we've heard earlier in this program today from Jeff Chen on our efforts through UCLA to help educate physicians. I think some physicians at this point are reluctant to discuss it, perhaps because they don't know what to say to their patients. And others are hesitant to use it because of their concerns. And I think this raises some concerns on the part of patients. Do patients tell the physician that they're taking cannabis or not? Is there a risk of losing that doctor who seems really good? I myself discuss it. So my patients with pain management, I'm going to be open to their using cannabis while they're using their opioids, because I'm going to say, let's use it to help reduce your opioid dose. It's not here we're using it to help reduce the opioids. That's my target.
So Doc, can you tell us a little bit about some of the health risks and side effects that you see in working with your clinical practice with medical cannabis?
Well, I think the first thing I'm most concerned about is the fact that, as a physician, I'm not recommending for recreational use. So THC, as we know, is usually psychoactive. Many of my patients in chronic pain have secondary depression, anxiety, panic disorders. They're psychologically brittle. They've been through a lot. Pain can be really demoralizing. When I give them if I were to give them THC or a high THC content cannabis, many of them say, I tried it and I really didn't feel very good. What happens is it can actually exacerbate some of their psychological problems in various ways. People who are chronic users can get a variety of problems, including cannabinoid-induced hyperemesis, which we've actually seen in the emergency rooms, people who are having nausea and vomiting nonstop after cannabis. So there certainly are definitely some risks. And of course, if one is inhaling it and you have underlying lung problem, it couldn't be detrimental. No data actually showing definitely cancer risk, but clearly could be irritating to the lungs. So I think the physician and the patient need to have a dialogue about the risks and benefits.
So Doc, one of the things in our functional medicine community, we have a lot of practitioners who are working with patients that have chemical sensitivities or other things. What did you learn on your trip that could help to inform other practitioners to get the most out of medical cannabis?
Since I do fibromyalgia, one of the components of fibromyalgia chronic fatigue is multiple chemical sensitivity. They're so sensitive to light, sound, and smells. Well, they're extremely sensitive to chemical components as well. And so in my original journey, I actually did field trips to local dispensaries, collectives, growers, etc. And I learned, for example, that much of the cannabis that's grown indoors might need to be treated with pesticides, fungicides, or there could be mold, for example. So I think it's really important for the consumer, that is the patient, to ask, is the cannabis that they're going to consider putting in their body, has it been tested with a toxicology report? Some, for example, one collective I know holds it in escrow until the toxicology report is done, and if it's positive, they reject the crop and will not distribute it to their members. So I think this is really important. Some states actually, like Colorado, actually have laws at the moment which actually require some toxicology done.
So Doc, maybe for our audience at home, you could take us through what are some of the most popular delivery mechanisms for medical cannabis, and which ones do you recommend for your patients?
Well, there's a variety of delivery mechanisms. Our patients are probably most familiar with smoking it, actually, as a joint or, for example, or through a vaporizer. But again, I mentioned, older patients, older adults, it could be irritating to some of them. Edibles are often considered, but edibles are tricky. You don't know when it's going to be absorbed. So you take an edible now, it's not necessarily going to have an immediate effect. It might be several hours down the road, and that's not giving you the immediate relief you want medically. Might be good for sleep, but it's not giving you that immediate relief. And will you be driving at that point? Will you be taking care of your kids? So, we tend to move on to other forms. The other problem with edibles, for example, is they tend to use the marijuana, but the marijuana is actually dissolved in fatty-like compounds like butter. So the distribution of butter on a brownie sheet can be very different. So one corner might be relatively dry, have minimal cannabis content, and the other corner have double or triple. So there's a kind of irregularity here. We need some good marijuana bakers. But the other issue here is also it can be interesting. Simple edibles like gummy bears only have it on the inside. There are some edibles now that have an outside crystalline coating, so you get more immediate action, and then you get a delayed reaction. My preference is to move on to sublingual delivery, which could be a tincture or an oil, or a sublingual nasal spray, where the absorption is fairly rapid. I think it's all part of a functional medicine program. So again, getting back to my patient with chronic pain, to me it's a facilitator. If I can use a medication that lowers your pain threshold, my goal is to get you to exercise and be more physically active. So to me, I tell patients, I want you to use this so you're going to be more active. Once your pain levels start dropping a little bit, there's no excuse for you not going out and exercising and working. Because again, the exercise is really what we're aiming for. The cannabis is, to me, it's the start, gets you to first base, but to get you to home plate, you're going to have to eat well. Your physician will go over your nutrition, your diet, but also a exercise program, which I regard as a prescription, not simply go out and exercise. I actually spend the time to talk to my patients about what we need to do in terms of their exercise.
So Doc, what are some recommendations that you'd have for other physicians who are thinking about recommending cannabis to their patients but haven't taken the leap?
I think the patient, as the consumer, and the physician need to be aware first is the THC content, because it is psychoactive. And I've had patients who before they came to me, and no one had asked them about it, went ahead and tried some cannabis, which was very high THC content, and had a psychological adverse effect, which we discussed earlier. And they didn't really want to try it again. So I actually, when I work with patients, I'll either start with a pure CBD or more likely a low THC content. We say 20 to 1 or 25 to 1 CBD THC, or no more than 4 to 5% THC, so we get started. Now, admittedly, some of the studies like in HIV neuropathy have shown you have best effect at 1 to 1, but I think I don't start there, because I have to respect my patients and how they react to it, because we're dealing with multiple systems again that are affected by cannabis.
I know you're very passionate about bone health and bone disease. What are some of the bright sparks and green shoots in the area of bone health and medical cannabis?
Well, in this program, we're going to be hearing a little bit about from Rafi Meshulam at Hebrew University in Israel, and that group and others have looked at effects on bone, and there's some signals that for example, in rodents who undergo menopause, that we might be able to prevent or treat. And there are other signals in another disease, osteogenesis imperfecta, which is the brittle bone disease, where children or adults get multiple fractures. It might be of help. We don't know this. Studies are on the way. This is all preclinical, not yet in humans, but I think it shows great promise in another system. There are some specific receptors in bone.
Doc, I know you said that there were some issues with product labeling, and that's been something that you've seen on your travels. What are some of the issues that you've seen, and what could be a solution for that?
Having, as part of my journey, visited dispensaries and collectives, when I walked in, I was overwhelmed. And I think that the patient as consumer is also overwhelmed. It's kind of like the consumer in the candy store, except someone took off all the labels. You don't really know. There are all these names for these strains. And you have to ask a lot of questions. Is this an indica? indica strain, what is it, what percent THC. I think that we need more transparent labeling. I've seen some beginnings of that in other states such as Colorado, indicating percent THC content, but also we're not labeling potency. The cannabis that my generation of baby boomers smoked decades ago is weaker compared to the potent strains we now have. So I think we really need to have more open labeling and discussions so the consumer can choose better. And I think as a physician right now here in California, I can only recommend, I can't prescribe. So we really need to be able to have the consumer who walks into the dispensary collective be able to have a reasonable, intelligent conversation until we get to the point where labeling is more transparent.
So what would you say to other doctors who are sort of sitting on the fence, not willing to sort of jump in and start to use these tools?
Their task is to learn more about it. I think as physicians, we need to feel comfortable discussing it with our patients. It's not surprising that I think many of the patients out there know more about medical cannabis use than do their physicians. So I think working with Jeff Chen, who we've heard earlier in this program, there is an effort here at UCLA to try to educate physicians and increase their awareness so they do feel comfortable in talking. And I think patients also really appreciate the fact they know their physician is working with them. And I think it's a dialogue and it's a conversation that can really have dramatic results in terms of decrease opioid use, improve functioning, and really help manage patients. Medical cannabis is an important part of a physician's armamentarium, but we're going to need to use toxicology reports. We're going to need to standardize it. We're going to need to have better consumer labeling. Yes, I think it's a great start that here in California it will be available in January, but I think we need to work together to make it more consumer and physician friendly.
So hopefully that gave you a really good idea about how some physicians are using medical cannabis right now in private practice. But one of the biggest questions that we've got is we hear from people who don't live in America, don't live in California, don't live in Colorado, or have different licenses and certifications, but want to get involved in the movement. And that's why we partnered with the Holistic Cannabis Academy. So this academy is a training program that was started by, co-founded by one of the original supporters of the Functional Forum. Laura Logano is a registered dietitian and a functional medicine nutritionist based in New Jersey, and she co-founded the Holistic Cannabis Academy to be able to empower more providers of all varieties to be able to get involved and take advantage of these natural compounds in a compliant and legal way. So we're going to hear a little bit more from Laura about the Holistic Academy and how you can get set up. So take it away.
The Holistic Cannabis Academy was developed specifically for progressive practitioners just like you. So my business partner Donna Shields and I both had personal experiences with cannabis. Donna is a breast cancer thriver and I have a daughter with developmental delay. They both have had stunning results with cannabis. We wanted to share this story with our nutrition colleagues and functional medicine colleagues. There was an issue. Number one, cannabis, there's a lot of canophobia. Cannabis is federally illegal, but here's the deal. Cannabis has actually been approved across the country in more than half the states around the world. Our Canadian neighbors are going to approve it across the entire country for recreational use. I can assure you that cannabis is going to be legalized in this country, in the US, very soon. Are you ready for that? Nobody. Our nutrition colleagues, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, even herbalists, believe it or not, have not been educated about cannabis or definitely not about the endocannabinoid system. So clearly there was a need for education and really solid education, not just some information about the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoids in plants and how to upregulate the system. Do you know about that? But also about how to really integrate that into your practice. Not the typical pharma bandage approach. Okay, let's replace Ambien with cannabis. That's ridiculous. We need to be integrating other modalities to make sure that we're upregulating that endocannabinoid system in total. So people ask us who we're educating. Physicians, nurses, pharmacists, nutritionists, health coaches, all of those holistic practitioners like yogis, aromatherapists, herbalists. We're already educating them all around the US and the rest of the globe. The Holistic Cannabis Academy is the only online cannabis training program for the Functional Forum community because we're progressive and holistic, just like you. We hope that you will join us.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of the Functional Forum. Whether you're watching at home or you're watching in one of our 500 communities around the world, we really hope that at the minimum this has been informative and will get some discussion going in your local community. At the maximum, maybe this changes the way that you practice medicine. You can see that we have a very different set of disease structures than 50 years ago. We have a lot more science on this area of the endocannabinoid system. We hope that this might stimulate a conversation about the future of medicine. Thanks so much for being part of our community. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be back next month with another Functional Forum. In the meantime, I'm your host, James Maskell, and we'll see you next time.